Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to be doing another car video, talking about the Ryzen 5000 series CPUs and the announcement event, like my thoughts on that. So, yeah, I'm excited for 5000 series, because like it looks like AMD finally is going to beat Intel at everything, except maybe Super Pi. Like that's probably the only benchmark where AMD is still not going to win, but yeah, for everything else, like this is the thing is like the the 5950X really looks like it just does everything. It has all of the cores. It has all of the IPC. It's got so much cache. Like the thing is the massive blob of cache. Like previously we had two big blobs of cache per CCD, and now we have one giant blob of cache per CCD. So that further just like hides the memory inefficiency of a Ryzen CPU. Like that's all. Like that's been the whole point of the massive amounts of cache that AMD's been putting into these chips for a very long time. Is just like hide the memory system because it is super slow. Anyway, so it just looks like we finally got CPUs that it's just like there's no reason to use Intel except some very niche benchmarks maybe. And I'm looking at this as from my overclocker perspective, not really like a daily user perspective. But for daily users, like it basically means the same thing. It's just like there's very little like assuming everything AMD said at the during the announcement event is true, and obviously wait for reviews, but um, like even if they're massaging the numbers by a couple percentage points upwards, like that still consistently beats Intel CPUs. So yeah, like there's going to be no reason to get an Intel CPU until Rocket Lake at this rate. And the funny thing is, Rocket Lake might catch up to AMD in terms of like performance. I I don't think it's going to do anything for efficiency. Because it's still on 14 nanometer, and basically Rocket Lake is just bigger cores on like which like finally we get a non-Skylake core, because that's the thing that we've been getting like on 14 nanometer we've literally been getting Skylake cores with steadily better memory controllers attached and more of them. That's basically all that we've been seeing from Intel. So Rocket Lake is very interesting in that we'll finally have a new core architecture from Intel. So there'll actually be an IPC increase after however long it's been. Um, but at the same time, like it's still on 14 nanometer, and more transistors means more power consumption. So yeah, that'll be like I don't think Intel is going to beat AMD on efficiency anytime soon. Um, but they might catch up in performance. So that'll be interesting to see. But for now, like until that happens, it looks like AMD just has the best CPUs, and so yeah, I'm really excited. Now you like yeah, that's cool. And I'm probably going to be getting a 5950X as soon as possible. Actually, not probably. I'm definitely getting it as soon as possible. So hopefully sometime this year. Because the thing is, like, like I expect there to be supply issues on launch day for the 5950 for all of the CPUs actually. And I'm basing this off of the fact that like the 3950X had supply problems. Like for a very long time, you had to search for a 3950X, and the same thing happened to the 3900X. It sold out very quickly. Um, and so I think the same is going to happen for basically all of the 5000 series CPUs, and I think that's part of why the price tags are so high now, right? Like that's been one of the thing I've seen a lot of people complaining about is just like, oh my god, 5000 series is so expensive. Why isn't AMD the cheaper option anymore? And it's just like there's multiple reasons for that. One, assuming what AMD is saying is true, AMD currently has better CPUs than Intel. There is no reason to buy Intel. You get more performance, you get better power efficiency, you get like why would you charge less for your superior product unless you have like massive amounts of supply, right? Like the only reason for AMD to be selling like say the only reason for pricing a 5600X at $200 instead of $300 would be if AMD had so many of them that they literally couldn't sell them. Right, like they'd be, sitting on shelves in warehouses for like months at a time, and it's just like, well, we need to lower prices because nobody's buying our products, right? Like that's the only reason you would lower your price if you have the better product than your competition, is if you also have too much of it. But I don't but considering how past Ryzen launches have gone, where it's been like, yeah, they sold out immediately, and there wasn't and then you had to wait for ages to get the high end parts for a while. I think AMD's new, higher prices are reflecting the fact that they don't expect to have tons and tons of chips. They're kind of trying to slow down how quickly they sell out. So hopefully I'll be able to actually get a 5950X, but I don't have high hopes for that because that chip specifically hasn't got that much of a price hike, right? It went from 750 to 800. Whereas the other CPUs have gone up. Well, the 5600X has gone up a lot. So much, in fact, that I've seen a lot of people going like, "Oh, I'm going to buy a 3700X instead of a 5600X," which I think is actually a really poor purchasing decision if you're a gamer, because consider this, right? So an 8-core CPU has 33% more cores than a 6-core CPU. Therefore, in a perfectly multi-threaded workload, at best, you're going to have 33% more performance. There. Like, that's it. You're going to get 33% more performance in a perfectly multi-threaded workload. Now, there are some anomalies where you might have a workload that for some reason spawns like an ungodly amount of threads and it doesn't know how to manage resources when you only have less than 8 cores or something like that, which, like, that can happen. And I think there are a couple games that actually do exactly that, but it's more an issue with like fast quad cores than it is with like fast high core than 6 cores. But it's not impossible to write a multi-threaded application that scales negatively as you lower core count, like has like sublinear scaling as you lower core count. But anyway, under most circumstances, if you have 6 cores that are 20% faster per core and per clock, right? Than what you have on your 8-core, the multi-threaded difference between the 6-core and the 8-core is going to be very, very small. Because the 8-core has a 33% core count advantage, while the 6-core has a 20% instructions per clock advantage, right? So there's like a 13% gap between those two. For multi-threaded workloads that don't do anything super weird, and, because the thing is, like, yeah, you can intentionally rewrite something so that it doesn't run on a 6-core properly. You would hope that nobody does that kind of thing because 8-core CPUs aren't exactly that common currently, but it's not impossible. You can also make applications that just implode if you present them with more than 16 threads or more than like a certain number of cores. That also exists. This game I'm playing right here will actually not launch if you have a system with more than 16 threads. Which is pretty funny. Games from 2010, so, what do you expect? But anyway, so from a gaming perspective, I think the 5600X is just a better gaming CPU than a 3700X, even though it has, less cores. And then there's also the fact that the 5600X might actually clock higher than a 3700X. Under gaming workloads or most circumstances, right? In which case, not only are you losing, that IPC advantage gets multiplied by a clock speed advantage, and the gap between, the gap between a 4 gigahertz, I'm going to exaggerate the values for this, but if you have a 6-core with 20% more IPC, clocked 10% higher, so running 4.4 gigahertz instead of compared to a 4 gigahertz 8-core. That 6-core is going to have the same multi-threaded performance, basically spot on, because you're getting 1.2 times 1.1, which is I'm not doing that math in my head. I want to say that's 1.32 for some reason. Yeah, it is 1.32. So yeah, so you'd have like maybe 1% multi-threaded performance gap, assuming there's also a 10% clock speed increase. Now, there's probably not going to be a 10% clock speed increase, though it depends on which CPUs you're comparing against each other. Like if we compare, like let's say the 5600Xs are capable of overclocking to the same speed as recently produced 3600 CPUs, right? If we compare that to say my launch day 3700X, yeah, that that's gonna this is gonna be very very one-sided. Because my launch day 37, like actually it's not launch day, but launch week 3700X is just absolutely atrocious, and the recently produced CPUs are so much better. So I really don't think AMD, like even compared to third gen offerings, I don't think AMD is overpricing their CPUs because like there's 20% more performance per clock. Like that's like having 20% more cores basically. And then if you clock that higher, it's like, yeah. Like the reason Intel's been stuck on 4 cores for so long is they were kind of hoping that those 4 cores would be getting really fast over time. And then they got stuck making Skylake chips over and over and over and over and over again. And so they had to start raising the core counts because if you're going to use the same core, the only thing you can really do is put more of them and hope for the best, right? But yeah, AMD's not really in that situation with the 5000 series. So I don't think the price points... So the price points make sense from like a performance perspective, a supply perspective. Like Intel doesn't have an answer. The 5600X is probably going to just wipe the floor with a 3700X and basically any... like, you know, the only workloads where a 5600X is going to lose to a 3700X is going to be like heavy multi-threaded stuff. Anywhere else, it's going to be in favor of the 5600X. And when the 5600X loses, it's not going to be by a very large amount. So basically, like the prices make sense. They're high, and as a customer, obviously, as a customer, your goal is to always get the maximum amount of product for the least amount of cost. Okay, so, you know, I would appreciate if the chips were cheaper, but I can also totally understand the price points. And I'm also assuming that AMD intends to lower the prices over time as they start, you know, matching supply, like demand with supply. Because that's the other thing is like if they start, you know, filling up warehouses with unsold CPUs because the price is too high, they're going to start lowering the prices. That's just how that works. Because warehouse space costs money, and so if you have unsold CPUs sitting around, like you're losing money on that. You don't want to have unsold CPUs sitting around, so you'll just lower the price at that point. So basically, it's a bit of a like early adopters tax, like low supply tax, performance tax, you know, and yeah. So the prices, yeah, they're high. I think they make sense. I don't really, you know, like that's the thing. It's just like this is what happens when, you know, you have the performance crown and the efficiency crown and the everything crown. So yeah. Anyway, so that's my thoughts on the price points. Then other than that, what I'm kind of wondering about, and then for the performance, like I'm just excited for the 5950X, right? Like I want a 5950X. It's going to be so good at so many benchmarks. And from the overclocking perspective, that's one thing I really wonder about. So on one hand, TSMC 7 nanometer has recently gotten like crazy good, right? Like compare 3600s and 3700Xs produced recently compared to like say my launch week 3700X, right, which can barely do 4.1 gigahertz. You compare that to the chips produced right now, and a lot of the chips produced right now can like bench. Oh, like actually, my launch week 3700X can like I don't think I can even boot like 4.4 gigahertz on that chip. It's really bad. Or I think like 2 cores can do 4.4 gigahertz with way too much voltage, and it's like you can barely run IDA, and yeah. Now you can get CPUs where you can actually run Cinebench on all cores at 4.4, 4.5, even 4.6 gigahertz, depending on how much voltage you're willing to shove into them. And so, yeah, like the recently produced chips are amazing. But at the same time, like with the 5000 series, I don't necessarily think that we're going to see the same kind of overclocking headroom on the 5000 series as we have on the late production 3000 series. Because I kind of think that a lot of the clock speed improvements that AMD and TSMC have made to the 7 nanometer process have been potentially swallowed up by the faster cores, bigger cache, like that kind of thing, like more efficient CPU. Because that's the thing is like normally if you increase IPC, you lose clock speed. Um, and so that's one thing I'm kind of wondering about is like, and AMD is obviously like the stock specs for those CPUs are going to be dialed in for what the manufacturing process can do right now, right? Which is why like if you look at the uh, early 3000 series CPUs, right? Those are basically those don't have any overclocking headroom because AMD dialed in the stock settings to reflect the precise capabilities of the 7 nanometer process at the time, right? Whereas, so now that they're launching a new line of CPUs, these are probably clocked, to the limit of what the process can do again. So I don't think we're going to necessarily see a ton of overclocking headroom on the CPUs coming out right now. Which is a bit sad, but because the thing is, like, the only reason you ever really get overclocking headroom is if you have an architecture that for some reason scales to like ungodly amounts of power consumption, right? Where and by that I mean something like Sandy Bridge, where you can take Sandy Bridge CPUs that mainly like my like I have most experience with Sandy Bridge E, so we'll use that. But you can take like a 3930K, which is a 3.2 gigahertz stock CPU with a 130 watt TDP. And if you shove enough voltage into it, those chips will do anywhere between 4.5 and 5 gigahertz. If you're really lucky, maybe 5.1. But in return for this massive clock speed increase, the chip also starts pulling like 3 times as much power as it did at stock. So you go from a 130 watt CPU to like 300 to 400 watts, which is like insane amounts of power consumption. And we don't see that anymore because you don't have CPUs where you're gonna, where they're not like most modern CPUs aren't limited by the power draw of the manufacturing process. They're limited by the absolute max clock speed of the manufacturing process, right? Like the only reason we would see a high overclocking headroom on Ryzen CPUs would be if AMD was targeting a 100 like a 50 watt stock TDP instead of a 105 watt TDP, which they're not. So we're not like there's a really good chance we're not going to see a ton of overclocking headroom in the cores again because AMD's probably rescaled the stock clocks to match the 7 nanometer process, and so we're back to having no headroom. Yay. Hopefully we'll see like, I don't know, maybe 7 nanometer will get another, manufacturing process upgrade towards the end of the 5000 series like the 3000 series got, and we'll get some really crazy overclocking 5000 series chips in the future. But initially, I don't think there's going to, like, there's no reason to leave headroom on the table, right? Like, there's no reason to ship CPU, like, unless you're power constrained, there's no reason to ship the chips at a lower clock speed. Intel didn't ship 300 watt Sandy Bridges because nobody wants a 300 watt CPU, or at least at the time, nobody wanted a 300 watt CPU, right? These days, that's no longer the case. Intel is shipping plenty of chips with absolutely ludicrous amounts of power consumption. We get GPUs with insane amounts of power consumption as well. But yeah, back then, you didn't really want to be selling a 300 watt CPU. But now it's like there's no reason to make a the Ryzen doesn't scale to 300 watts, or even 200 watts. Like the scaling to 200 watts is pretty miserable as well. So there's just no reason to not ship to do something like that, and that's why the chips are shipping maxed out at 105 watt TDP. Though I'm assuming the 5900X and the 5950X probably still have a 150 watt actual power limit, which is why there's like even less overclocking headroom. Like if the chips actually followed the 105 watt TDP, then you might have some headroom, but they don't. They have a 150 watt power limit, and the only reason they won't run at that 150 watt power limit is if you don't have enough cooling or your motherboard's inadequate. Which actually that's another thing that I wanted to bring up with the price points. So the 5600X compared to say a 10600K, right? Or a 10700K, or really any of the like upcoming 5000 series Ryzen CPUs compared to competing Intel CPUs. Like AMD has a huge advantage in the A520 and the B550 chipsets. Right, so Z490 is generally a pretty expensive platform because 10600Ks, 10700Ks, 10900Ks, all of these CPUs, they pull a lot of power. They pull even more power if you decide to overclock them. Intel doesn't have a chipset with unlocked memory overclocking. It's just Z4. If you want full memory overclocking range, you need Z490. There's no other chipset that you can get for memory overclocking. And so basically but AMD, with A520, you could stick a 5600X into your A520 motherboard. The 5600X probably has no overclocking headroom. So you get this really cheap board. You get a good kit of memory, which the board can still run anyway because, it's Ryzen. The memory controller is amazing. And it's not that hard to get. Like at this point, like motherboards have matured so much that getting high clock speeds out of DDR4 really isn't that difficult. Right? And also Ryzen's memory controller is well, we'll get to that later, but the thing is Ryzen's memory controller is kind of limited to like 3800 megahertz currently, and so it's just like you don't even need that much clock speed anyway. And that's limited by the FCLK, but so, you get so what I'm trying to get at is if you're just directly comparing the price of a 5600X or a 5800X to equivalent Intel CPUs, it's not a fair comparison because you can run those AMD CPUs on really, really cheap motherboards. And you're not going to lose any performance. With the 5600X, you're not going to lose any performance at all. And you can still overclock your memory. So yeah, you could get a $70, $60 A520 motherboard, stick your 5600X in that, and, honestly, actually, you could still run a 3080 with that, probably. It'd be a little bit imbalanced, but maybe, if you wanted something a bit more balanced, you could do 5800X plus 3080 on a A520 motherboard, because you're going to run the CPU at stock anyway, and the memory overclocking works just fine. So yeah, what you save on your motherboard, you can spend on your CPU is basically what's going on with AMD's prices as well. Now then, the memory side of things, that's going to be interesting. So from what I've been reading and hearing, it sounds like AMD is not giving us a new I/O die. Which makes sense because that's, not redesigning the I/O die means more money for AMD to spend on designing CPU cores, right? Oh, come on. Needed more breaks there. Anyway, but yeah, so redesigning the I/O die, if you don't have to, why would you? And the thing is, for the vast majority, the thing is, AMD's primary, I'm not sure how it works out, but I would assume that AMD probably sells more CPUs to OEMs than they sell to enthusiasts. And if that's the case, then it's just like OEMs aren't going to care about having systems with 4000 megahertz XMPs, right? So there's no reason to give you a better I/O die. But at the same time, I'm kind of wondering if they might not have done something to the substrate, right? Because the thing is, what limits the reason why you don't run Ryzen CPUs with more than 3800 megahertz memory is because the FCLK doesn't really go above 1900 megahertz. But the main reason the FCLK doesn't go above 1900 megahertz is not because the Infinity Fabric inside the I/O die and inside the CPU cores is slow, but because the Infinity Fabric has to go through the substrate between the I/O die and the CPU cores. And the substrate, well, it's not really ideal for high-frequency communication. Especially because, if I'm not mistaken, the Infinity Fabric over package runs at some really crazy high frequency because they didn't want to make it really wide. Because basically, if you have a wider interface, you can run it lower clocks to get the same bandwidth as if you have a thinner interface but running at higher clocks. And if I'm not mistaken, the current implementation of the Infinity Fabric on Ryzen CPUs runs really high clock speeds and is kind of skinny. And so what that means is basically the Infinity Fabric clock limit isn't so much what the silicon can do, it's what the substrate can do. And so theoretically, AMD could take the same old I/O die and stick it onto a upgraded substrate with better signal integrity. And without doing anything to the I/O die, we could see higher FCLKs. And I'm saying we could. I'm not saying we will, but we could. If they gave us a new, better substrate, we could see higher FCLKs, even though they're still using the same I/O die. And then you can obviously run higher memory speeds, or they maybe just optimize the way the substrate is laid out or something. This is really kind of like basically think about it like this: you take a CPU with a strong memory controller, you stick it into a bad motherboard, your memory overclocking is gonna your memory overclocking is gonna suck. You take that same CPU, you stick it into a really good motherboard, and you can suddenly run like, well, depends how bad the original motherboard was, but you could end up running like a gigahertz more memory clock speed, right? Which is like, that's a huge increase by just changing the motherboard. And most of that's down to things like, well, with motherboards, it's also the BIOS plays a big role, but a lot of it also comes down just to the trace layout and the PCB and how the PCB is set up. And so similarly, AMD could very easily take the I/O die they currently have and just adjust the substrate and get more Infinity Fabric clock without having to redesign the silicon at all, right? Because it would basically be a motherboard upgrade for the I/O die and the chiplets, instead of a CPU level motherboard upgrade. So that's one way to think about it. But I'm not sure if they're doing that. It wouldn't surprise me if they were, because I would assume a better substrate probably costs significantly less than redesigning the I/O die. So yeah, that's kind of like I'm excited, right? We might see higher Infinity Fabric clocks. We're definitely like the other thing is the fact that they've unified the cache for each chiplet for each of the CCDs, means that the memory panel, the Infinity Fabric is less important, especially on something like a 5800X and the 5600X. The Infinity Fabric should be far less important than it used to be, because on current Ryzen CPUs, if you have a single CCD chip, it still has two CCXs, and the CCXs can't talk to each other directly. They have to go through the Infinity Fabric to the I/O die, then and then back to the other CCX, and it's just like, so any communication between core 0 and core 5, right, is going to have to happen over the Infinity Fabric. And that's why overclocking the Infinity Fabric is so important for performance. It's also why the 3100 is such a terrible, slow CPU compared to the 3300X. Well, okay, it's not a terrible CPU, but that's why the 3100 is so much slower than a 3300X. Is just like the Infinity Fabric is connecting your CCXs, so you can't quickly access the cache of one core from some cores, right? Like, which now with the unified cache for the entire CCD, on a 5800X or a 5600X, any core can talk to any other core without ever going through the Infinity Fabric. So that basically makes all of those CPUs like a 3300X, and they should be far less sensitive to Infinity Fabric overclocking than what we have right now. The 5900X and 5950X, however, they're still dual CCD CPUs, so, if Core 0 wants to talk to Core 11, that has to go through the Infinity Fabric, and so those should still see more scaling from Infinity Fabric overclocking than, say, the 5800X or the 5600X. So yeah, like Ryzen 5000 is very, very interesting. We might see more Infinity Fabric clock. Infinity Fabric might also be less important. So, what would be really cool is if you have both, right? And also the fact that you now have 64 megabytes of 32 megabytes of cache available to any core within a CCD instead of 16 megabytes of cache means that, if you're really running one single-threaded workload that is a horrible memory hog, that one single-threaded workload can now basically access 32 megabytes of cache instead of 16. Which can have significant performance advantages because now it doesn't have to access the memory as much. So basically, like on one, like basically AMD, like if the Infinity Fabric overclocking doesn't improve, it still doesn't really, like, that doesn't necessarily mean too much, because these CPUs should be far less reliant on Infinity Fabric clock than their predecessors. And at the same time, we might actually see better Infinity Fabric overclocking just because of a new substrate or something. So, yeah. Anyway, that's my thoughts on the 5000 series. Very very exciting. Um, with you know, everything we're getting is just like more IPC, less dependence on the memory system, potentially better memory system anyway, right? Like, I'm really excited for these chips. And so, yeah, and like right now, the only downside is the prices, but I'm sure the prices are going to come down over time. So, there. That's it for the video. Thanks for watching. Hopefully, you found this somewhat interesting. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the HOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, stickers, posters, you know, the usual YouTuber merch. Both of them help out immensely with running the channel. How do you think I'm going to get a 5950X? Yeah. So much appreciated if you'd check out those links. And that's it for I'm actually going to hit the stop button now. So thanks for watching. Goodbye.